Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Miller Johnson's, Friday morning webinar on Back to Work. I am Sarah Willey, and I am here today with my fantastic sidekick and colleague, Sandy Andre. And I have to tell you, as I came in this morning to teach this webinar today to talk about breaking COVID-19 news and back to work questions, I felt almost as if a year had not passed. It was a bit of a deja vu, right, Sandy? But welcome this morning. We are going to talk to you at all. We are going to spend the next half hour, 45 minutes talking about all the questions we are getting right now from clients with regard to returning employees to work. And as you guys know, likely on Monday, our governor announced that in 2 weeks, that remote work mandate, which largely applied to office employees, is going to be lifted. So we're going to be talking a little bit about what that means. We're going to be talking about what COVID protocols are likely still going to be in place, even when we bring all of those employees back. And we're going to be answering the vaccine-related questions that businesses seem to have, that we're getting people calling with, we're getting emails about, and we've even gotten questions from all of you. And we're going to be talking about what to do with those employees who don't want to return or can't return because of health-related issues. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. Thank you for joining us today. We will do our best to answer all of the questions you have and get you all the information you want to hear. So with that, Sandy is going to kick us off and get us started. Hi, Sandy. How are you doing?
Good morning. Thanks, Sarah. And good morning, everybody. And Sarah hit the nail right on the head, talking a little bit about deja vu, because as we were talking this week, preparing for this webinar, we realized that it was last year, this week, that we were preparing for the first stay-at-home order to be relaxed. And some folks, were heading back to work for the first time back then. So everything old is new again.
And Sandy, I forgot to cover one important thing when I greeted everybody this morning that I meant to mention, and I can't believe I forgot about it. So I'm going to get that out of the way first. Is that okay?
You bet.
It's about the new the big announcement from the CDC yesterday.
Perfect.
If all of you have not heard already, you will very, very soon. The CDC announced yesterday that it no longer believes that fully vaccinated employees need to wear masks, either indoors or outdoors, in most settings. There are exceptions to that, obviously, in healthcare and when you travel and things like that. So that is a huge shift. But of course, Sandy, that means that people are wondering if we're here in Michigan, what does that mean with regard to the mask requirements that we have here in Michigan? We have our Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, the Michigan DHHS, has issued an emergency order requiring masks in certain settings. And also the Michigan Occupational Health and Safety Agency, MIOSHA, says that employers have to require employees to wear masks if they can't maintain 6 feet of separation. And so I'm just going to answer a lot of questions off the bat, and I can tell you all that what the CDC said yesterday, that guidance that got changed, did not in any way change either the Michigan DHHS order or MIOSHA's emergency rules. Both of those are still in place and enforceable. Okay, so retail businesses and other businesses that have to require masks in their spaces still have to require masks. Gyms, stores, all of those places we're going, right? And employers are still subject to that MIOSHA rule saying employees have to wear masks at work. We don't know yet when and if that is going to change. And in fact, the first thing Sandy and I did when we got to work today was to check whether our governor has scheduled a press conference yet today. She hasn't yet, maybe later this afternoon, and perhaps we'll be talking about that on Monday. But as you have employees coming to work today saying, I don't have to wear a mask anymore, you can and should absolutely tell them, I'm sorry that nothing has changed yet with the requirements that are in place in Michigan. Those are still in place and we still need to comply with them. Okay, with that, Sandy, let's talk more specifically about return to work.
Excellent. Well, that is a great overview of kind of many of the pieces that we'll be talking about today, and understanding the interplay on the existing MDHHS order and the existing MIOSHA order, and what changed and what hasn't since Governor Whitmer announced the Michigan Vacc-to-Normal program. So you may remember several weeks ago, April 29th, Governor Whitmer announced Michigan's Vacc-to-Normal Plan, which essentially is outlining a vaccination-based milestones to reopen various sectors of the economy and relax certain COVID-19 mitigation requirements that are currently in place. And so at that time, the graphic we've got here on the screen, at that moment, 48.8% of eligible Michiganders had received at least their first shot. And those vaccine milestones, right? There are multiple steps, 4 steps. The first step, and each of them are spaced a little bit, right? Once you achieve the milestone at any certain step, there's kind of this 2-week period, and then the restriction is lifted or modified in some way. And so immediately we all got very excited because we happened to notice what was step one. Step one was, once we achieve 55% of eligible Michiganders getting their first shot, 2 weeks after that is when in-person work for all business sectors could resume. And that was huge news because we know that we've been operating under the MIOSHA emergency rules since last October. And we know that Rule 5.8 says that generally employers must prohibit in-person work to the extent employees can complete their work activities remotely feasibly. So that was excellent news. So what was even more exciting this Monday, right, May 10th, the governor announced that Michigan had reached that 55% milestone, and that 2-week clock had started to run. And so has identified Monday, May 24th, as the day that in-person work for all business, all sectors of business could be reopened. So that's really exciting news. So since then, right, we've been getting lots of questions about how to plan for that and what we need to be thinking about. Okay, Sandy and Sarah, if this part of the MIOSHA rule is kind of being rescinded based on the Michigan Vacc-to-Normal program, what other pieces of the rule are rescinded? So let's pause there and let's talk about none of the MIOSHA rule, right? There's 11 emergency rules, right? They came into place in October of 2020. They were just extended in April. So we plan to have them in our lives right now until October of 2021, unless they are rescinded or revised in some way by MIOSHA. And as we sit here today, right, on May 14th, MIOSHA has not rescinded or revised Emergency Rule 5 sub 8. state that talks about employers needing to prohibit in-person work to the extent work activities can be completed remotely. But we believe, right, we have no reason to believe that they won't be doing that. In fact, the governor did have a press conference earlier this week and talked a little bit about MIOSHA getting to work on that piece to coordinate with the Michigan Vacc-to-Normal program. And in fact, MIOSHA has updated a few FAQs on their website, giving us hints that that's the direction that they are going as well. So that all seems to be in line. So this FAQ here, I heard the governor is withdrawing the requirements for working remotely. Does that mean I am required to go back to work in person? And so here, the requirement in the MIOSHA emergency rules for COVID-19 for employers to have a remote work policy is still in place. Once the requirement is rescinded, your employer can require you to resume in-person work. However, employers may still be required to follow the remaining mitigation strategies contained in the MIOSHA rule. And so we know that back in mid-April, MIOSHA also submitted a draft final rule to the Michigan Office of Administrative Hearings and Rules for a permanent, I'm using air quotes here, a permanent COVID-19 rule. And we've done webinars and talked a little bit about what some of those rules might be. And one of those proposed rules, right, was a change to this remote work requirement and changing the verbiage to reflect the following. The employer shall create a policy promoting remote work for employees to the extent that work activities can feasibly be completed remotely, and gives examples of what they mean by feasibly, technically, economically, or performance-based. So it would not be surprising to us if that's what the revised MIOSHA Rule 5 sub 8 looks like come May 24th. But we don't know, right? This conversation is intended to say, we have no reason to believe that a change to that rule won't be made. We just don't know what the exact change will be. And we don't know what other MIOSHA rules might be changed along with that. So that goes right into the next piece of our conversation here. Okay, so let's presume that MIOSHA does make a change to Rule 5 sub 8. What else do I need to do? As Sarah and I were contemplating this webinar, we want to recognize that for many of our listeners, you have had portions of your workforce back doing in-person work for a while. Maybe their work couldn't have been feasibly done remotely way back when. Maybe you all were listed as an essential employer, and that's why folks were on site back then. But there may be a few of you who have been, your entire workforce has been remote this whole time for upwards of a year now. And so you need a refresher on, okay, Sandy and Sarah, if I can come back, if I can open my office for my employees to come back on Monday, May 24th, what do I need to be doing? And so the first place that you need to look is to these emergency rules that MIOSHA issued that as of right now are effective until October 14th, 2021. And generally there are 11 areas that you need to be mindful of. And we'll briefly review them right now, but I will tell you that Miller Johnson has done a number of webinars specifically about the MIOSHA rules. I'll point you back to the very first one that we did right after these rules were issued on October 16th, 2020. You can find that on our website for a discussion into all of the details related to these rules if you need something more than what we'll briefly review this morning. But generally that's going to require the employer completing an exposure determination for all employers are required to do that. So all the jobs in your organization, you as the employer have to review the job and that individual's potential contact with the hazard, right? And the hazard we're talking about is COVID-19. So it's going to vary based on the types of customers that they interact with, how often they interact with customers, or if you're in healthcare, patients, how often they're around their coworkers, all of those pieces. Of course, you will need a COVID-19 preparedness and response plan. All employers are required to have that and to have that plan accessible to your employees. You're also required to follow basic infection prevention measures. All employers are required to do that, and it's actually in that portion of the rule where that remote work requirement lives. So you'll understand with each of these headings, there's various subparts that tell you a little bit about the details. Also required to complete health surveillance. All employers are required to do that, and we talk a lot about that when we talk about daily entry screenings. Right now, those requirements have not gone away, and we don't know if they are going away, right? But that generally includes at least a questionnaire of employees who are working on site, if they are experiencing symptoms, if they've tested positive, if they've had close contact, all of those pieces. Also required to institute workplace controls, and this is where the masking requirement lives, right? Employers are required to provide non-medical grade face masks to their employees. Employers must require employees wear face masks when they cannot consistently maintain 6 feet of separation, and when they are in any shared spaces, including in-person meetings, restrooms, hallways, all of those pieces. Also, PPE requirements for all employers. That folds in a little bit, referring back to the respiratory protection standard. There's various industry-specific requirements. So if you are in an industry like construction or manufacturing, restaurants and bars, healthcare, personal care services, places of public accommodation, meat and poultry processing facilities, casinos. If you're in any of those industries, there are a few industry-specific requirements that will apply to you. All employers are required to provide their employees training that minimally covers workplace infection control practices, the proper use of PPE, steps an employee must take to notify the business if that employee is having symptoms of COVID or has a suspected or confirmed diagnosis of COVID, and instructing your employees on how to report unsafe working conditions there in your organization. And for the cherry on top, right, there's also a record keeping requirement for employers, where employers are required to retain records related to training, to screening protocols, and to the notifications that you do. If you have a positive case in your workplace, you're required to keep documentation related to those trainings for a year. So again, if you have any questions about any of those specific requirements, you could just hop on the Miller-Johnson website and look back at some of our historical webinars, and we have a lot of resources related to each of these pieces on our resource center as well. So if this is the first time you're hearing about a preparedness plan, we can help you with that. If you have no idea how to conduct daily entry health screenings and the questions you need to ask, we have resources for those as well. But for the rest, we'll go ahead and we'll move on a little bit. So as I mentioned,
hey, Sandy, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can I just reiterate a couple of your points to answer a lot of questions that are similar that are coming in? Perfect. And I think you've answered them, but I'm just going to sort of put a pin in it, so to speak. So to be clear, number one, the MIOSHA rules have not changed since they were first implemented back in October. They are the exact same rules. Not a single word has changed. In April, they just extended the exact same rules. Okay, so when you go back and listen to our webinar from last October, that information is all still going to be the same with regard to the content of those MIOSHA rules. With regard to masks, I'm seeing a lot of questions related to when do we have to require masks, and I'm sure that is largely due to the CDC's announcement yesterday talking about people not having to wear masks. So the MIOSHA rules currently say in any workplace, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, you have to require face coverings, which now has been defined to mean masks, whenever employees cannot consistently maintain 6 feet of separation from each other. And if they can't maintain 3 feet, then you're supposed to consider face shields. Okay, so number one, in your workplace, you have to require masks if people are working within 6 feet of each other on a consistent basis. And in addition to that, you have to require masks in shared spaces, including during in-person meetings and in restrooms and hallways. Okay, so if you're thinking about an office setting, when people are working individually in their offices and nobody is within 6 feet of them, they don't have to wear a mask. But when they get up to go walk around, get stuff off the printer, use the restroom, etc., they are supposed to be wearing masks. Equally so, as it stands right now with the rules, employees are supposed to be wearing masks during in-person meetings, and no, there is not an exception yet to that for people who are fully vaccinated, okay? Is that coming? Yes, I think that probably is coming, but it has not happened yet. So as it stands today, that's what MIOSHA requires, masks during in-person meetings, even if everyone there has been fully vaccinated. I know that's frustrating, but that's what the rule is today. I think it'll probably change in the near future. Okay, sorry about that, Sandy. Continue on.
No, perfect. Thank you. So that just goes perfectly right into our next slide, talking a little bit about required office workplace protocols under the MIOSHA rules. So you remember in the previous slide, I flagged for you that there are some industry specific requirements, and I listed a number of industries. Office spaces per se are not identified to have their own special set of rules, but it's important for us to flag a couple things, particularly for this audience, right? So as Sarah and I were sitting down thinking about the webinar, right, in the excitement related to the achieving, right, step 1 of the Michigan Vacc-to-Normal program and who that would likely implicate, right? So if we know that in-person work can resume and we kind of paused and said, okay, well, who's not yet in person? And it's generally going to be, right, folks who are in office or administrative roles, right? If you have employees who you run a manufacturing line, those folks have likely been back in person for some time. And so generally, right, this new exciting piece is generally going to impact office type of workers and office type of settings more than some of the other settings, right? Or even, for example, if you are a manufacturing employer, you certainly could have had your line up and running and folks here, but maybe all of your office folks have been remote for a year. And so we're going to now need to be folding those folks bring those folks back into the fold. And so we wanted to flag a couple things that are important for those individuals to know. Maybe you have not done any education with these folks because they've been remote. And so we just want to make sure we're flagging those pieces. So the first piece is the daily entry screening protocols. You remember that we talked about under the existing MIOSHA rules, that is required and it must consist of at least a questionnaire asking employees or whoever is entering about symptoms or suspected or confirmed exposure to people with possible COVID, and if possible, a temperature screening. So that's the general requirement. So for folks who haven't yet been coming in the office, right, if they've been home for a year, they haven't been doing these entry screening protocols. And so part of your communication with bringing folks back to the office is to make sure that you're informing these folks that that's something that they need to expect because it's something that you're required to conduct. Now, the good news is related to isolation and quarantine requirements, right? As an employer, you need to be aware of your obligations under Michigan's, if you're a Michigan employer, under Michigan's COVID-19 Employment Rights Act, right? And so that indicates, right, if I am an employee who has tested positive for COVID, I am prohibited from going to the workplace until these conditions are met, right? And generally that's, 10 days past positive test, symptoms improving, fever-free, those pieces. If I am somebody who is suspected of having COVID, or I'm having symptoms, I guess I should say, I am prohibited from going to my, reporting for in-person work until certain requirements are met. And that can be going and getting a negative test, or until my 10 days, after symptoms improve and fever-free, all those pieces. Or if I am somebody who has been in close contact with somebody who has tested positive, I am prohibited from returning to the workplace under certain conditions, right? And generally that is going to follow the CDC recommendations. And this is where vaccination status does matter, okay? So if I'm fully vaccinated, I know that I don't need to participate in close contact quarantine. The CDC has said that, and Michigan's COVID-19 Employment Rights Act adopts that. But as you're communicating with your office staff, you're going to need to let them know that that's something that they are going to be subject to when they return. And then you as the employer need to think about the logistics associated with that, right? You've got a little bit of time here. How are we going to complete that when we have all of these office folks coming back to work? Is that an electronic tool? Is that right? Somebody sitting right in the front door and checking people in? How is that going to go? So you're going to want to put some thought to that. The second piece that particularly if you're primarily office workers that have been remote, something that you may not have had experience with is understanding your requirements, what we call positive case protocol notifications. So as the employer, when you become aware of a positive case in your workforce, right, in your employees, you are required to make a couple of notifications relatively quickly. The first is to the local public health department when an employee is reported to you that they have tested positive, okay? And then the second, the second notification is to any employees who may have had contact with that individual, letting them know that there was a positive case in the workplace. And of course, to be able to do those notifications, you need to be able to evaluate who that person could have had contact with. And so you're going to want to build in some mechanisms to do some of that contact analysis and contact tracing, but recognizing and making sure that you're aware of your requirements under those pieces. And then the next piece, and Sarah hit on this with the Q&As and kind of the announcement about the new CDC guidance this morning, is the workplace controls, and the big ones that we have been getting is to reinforce that social distancing and masking requirements have not been rescinded, right? The MIOSHA rules related to both are still in force, even though we are now going to be permitted to resume in-person work. And even though the CDC has said, right, fully vaccinated people don't need to mask indoors or out, those pieces of the MIOSHA rule have not gone away. So you as the employer need to make sure that you continue to enforce those rules. And the shared spaces may be the piece that's difficult here, right? I think we can all understand, okay, when I'm working alone in my office and someone else comes in, all of those pieces. But now if we've got this influx of folks coming back to the office, we may be resuming in-person meetings. Cafeterias might come back to life, right? The check-in areas or waiting areas, or wherever our front and back entry and exit, maybe they're about to get a bit more crowded. And so it's important for you as the employer, but also to communicate to your employees the expectations that they are still masking whenever they are in any of those spaces at this point, despite what their vaccination status might be. Okay.
Hey, Sandy, can we talk about cubicles for just a second?
Sure.
So many questions about cubicles are coming in, which makes a lot of sense to me because probably a lot of the people who have been working remotely to date and are potentially coming back now in the next few weeks might be employees who are working in cubicles, okay? So as I mentioned, and Sandy's made clear, the mask requirement is present for employees that can't maintain a 6 feet of distance between each other. But MIOSHA also has an FAQ in which it says if there is a physical barrier between employees, they are also not required to wear a face mask, okay? So as you think through your workspace in which employees are working in cubicles, those employees aren't required to wear a mask if the cubicles are at least 6 feet apart, or they're closer than that, but there is a physical barrier between them and the next employee. I'm getting lots of questions about how high that barrier has to be, and MIOSHA does not get into that level of detail. But I certainly think the intent would be, it needs to be high enough so that those respiratory droplets are not going to spread to the person working next to you as they're talking on their phone going about the workday, right? So, I mean, I would think it needs to be as high as they're, right? If they're sitting, that barrier should be above their head or so. Okay, carry on.
Very good, excellent. In coming back to some of the pieces to specifically flag for your office folks, we talked a little bit about it in the overview, is the training, right? So again, if you have had folks who have been working on site, you probably provided training to them when they first returned and have been providing training to them in some form, communication or updates to your COVID preparedness plan that you've been communicating back and forth with them since they've been on site. But again, if you've got a population who this is the first time they're returning, right, in any kind of meaningful way since COVID or since these emergency rules have gone in place, we're going to want to make sure that we're providing an avenue for training for them. And we need to make sure that that training includes at least these pieces listed here on the screen, right? You need to give them an overview of your workplace infection control practices, proper use of PPE, the steps employees need to take to notify you if they are experiencing symptoms or have a suspected or confirmed diagnosis or contact with somebody with a confirmed diagnosis. So the last piece here is kind of a little bit about what we've been talking about all morning, right? Could there be other changes? Could there be new rules? Could there be changes to these rules before May 24th? And the answer to that is absolutely yes, there could be, right? We expect at least one. We know that we have a pretty good idea that at least one change to these rules is coming, right? We expect that the MIOSHA Rule 5 Sub 8 is going to be changed in some way, because that's going to be the green light to allow us to resume in-person work without this link to right feasibility for remote work. So we expect that, but there certainly could be others. You may remember that back in March, the state established a return to office work group, and it consisted of business, labor, public health leaders. And the goal was to provide Governor Whitmer with recommendations to inform MDHHS and MIOSHA policies and guidance. So that group had been working. That group actually met weekly from mid-March to April, towards the end of April, and generally focused on 4 areas: changes to physical workplaces, HR policies, public health issues, and employee supports. And we know that that the same day, actually, that Governor Whitmer announced the Michigan Vacc-to-Normal program is when this return to work or excuse me, return to office work group submitted their recommendations to the governor. And so it's certainly likely that some of those recommendations are right, that MIOSHA is considering those right now and determining which ones of those impact other changes that they might want to make to the MIOSHA rules. So the key takeaway here is understanding that the MIOSHA rules as we sit here this morning have not changed. We expect at least one of them to be revised, but there could be additional revisions. So as we look at the next 10 days, right? If we're targeting May 24th to return, there certainly could be additional requirements or loosened requirements for what the actual return to the office might look like on that day compared to what we're talking about. But you can depend on Miller Johnson to be communicating with you all a lot about that, and we're watching that very closely. Now let's briefly talk about vaccination status. We've alluded to it a little bit, but a big question we've been getting on the heels of CDC guidance being issued just last night, but also over the last couple weeks about kind of loosened restrictions on what fully vaccinated people can be doing. And so the question we've been getting is, does that impact any of the COVID-19 rules employers have to follow? And so I think what we've said throughout this presentation, we want to take a minute to be really clear. As we look at Michigan employers, the only impact related to some of those loosened requirements or recognition of full vaccination status is related to quarantine requirements, right? So the CDC has said fully vaccinated folks can refrain from quarantine and testing following a known exposure if they are asymptomatic. In Michigan's COVID-19 Employment Rights Act recognizes that because it says close contacts must complete a quarantine period, and that quarantine period is whatever the CDC says it is. So the CDC has recognized full vaccination status in a different quarantine period for folks in that bucket, which means no quarantine period. And so that is folded into Michigan law under the COVID-19 Employment Rights Act, but not into the MIOSHA rules as they exist, and not into MDHHS emergency orders as they exist today. Again, Sarah and I are both hopeful that that changes related to both of those pieces, right? The MDHHS order and the MIOSHA rules. But as we sit here today, that is the only impact from an employment standpoint, you as the employer, about what employees can do or lessen restrictions related to employees who have full vaccination status. Next question we're getting, okay, we're bringing people back to the office. Can I ask people if they are vaccinated? Can I ask them their vaccination status? Is that allowed? And so the EEOC, the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has said yes. Asking an employee or requesting proof of receipt of a COVID-19 vaccination is not a disability-related inquiry, and typically those would be prohibited under the Americans with Disabilities Act unless certain requirements are met. But the EEOC has said, yes, you can ask, and you can ask employees to provide you proof of that. And so, but you do, right? You're going to need to maintain that record in a confidential employee file, right? That is medical information. So you're going to want to make sure you have appropriate safeguards. And so generally the next question I get is, okay, well, why would I ask? Why would I want to know that, Sandy? And the reason you would want to know that, right? Because, hey, Sandy, you just told me that my employee's full vaccination status kind of means nothing right now in Michigan from an employment standpoint. But you do still want to know that because of point number one up top here, right? You know that if you have a positive case in your workplace and you can identify close contacts, if you've got folks in that close contact pool who are fully vaccinated, you know that they don't need to go out for quarantine. And so from a staffing standpoint and notification standpoint, all of those pieces, it will be very helpful for you to know an employee's vaccination status for that reason. And fingers crossed, Sarah and I both have fingers crossed here, we hope that vaccination status allows for relaxation of other rules as we continue on this journey. So that will be an even more important data point for you to have. The next question we get, can I require my employees to get a vaccine? And the answer to that is yes, under certain conditions. And I'll pause right here and say, we're not going to get into this topic a bunch this morning because we have done a number of webinars on mandating the COVID-19 vaccine and the considerations that need to go into that. So I'll once again kind of direct you back to the Miller-Johnson website. There was a webinar on December 18th and one on January 27th that talk about mandating the COVID-19 vaccine in detail in all of those pieces. So just generally, I'll say yes, you can require employees to get the vaccine. The EEOC has said the COVID-19 vaccine is not a medical exam, but you need to flag a couple of considerations. And one is your obligations under the ADA or Title VII, right? So if you've got an employee with a disability, you must have or request a religious accommodations, you need to have an accommodation process ready to go, right? If an employee has a legitimate disability or a sincerely held religious belief and they say, I cannot get the vaccine, right? Right, employer, you're now mandating the vaccine and here's the reasons I can't get it and it falls under the protections of the ADA or Title VII, you need to have a process in place to evaluate that request. Okay.
Hey, Sandy, a quick question.
Yes.
If employers do ask employees whether they've been vaccinated and perhaps get a copy of their vaccination card, where should they keep that information?
Yeah, you do need to be keeping that in a confidential medical file, so not in the regular HR file.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, and with that, I will hand it over to you, Sarah, to start to talk about the real bugaboo here. What if my employees don't want to come back?
Right, something we've been talking about all along, really, because different employees have been required to come into work, some of which from the very beginning, of course, manufacturing and healthcare and retail employees, grocery stores, et cetera, being the primary examples. And then over the last 15 months or so, other employees as well have been deemed to be essential and have been coming back to work. And so all along, we have seen a number of different reasons why employees are not able to work in person and or do not want to work in person. And the good news is we've gotten pretty good at managing those concerns and sort of knowing what is likely to happen, okay? One thing we've learned is that communication is key. So if you have a number of employees who have been working remotely and are now going to be required to come back into the workplace, whether it's on May 24th, once MIOSHA changes that rule, or sometime after that, I just highly, highly encourage you all to put together a communication that is thoughtful and addresses the safety protocols that are going to be in place in the workplace, okay? We have seen return to work go much more smoothly for employers who at the front end had a very intentional communication and intentional and thoughtful communication plan, and it doesn't go quite as well for organizations that haven't done that. And by the way, largely, most of the time, employers haven't done that previously is because they've been putting out fires, right? So, but now we really do have an opportunity to take some time and step back and put together a letter or email communications, whatever it is, that explains to employees why they need to be back in the workplace now. What is it about their job? What is it about the organization? Why is it important to have everybody come back? That communication should address safety, of course. People have been told for 15 months that it's not safe to be in the workplace. And so some of your employees are not going to understand what suddenly changed. And they're going to need your help in explaining to them what measures have been put in place and why it really is okay now for them to come back to work. And then the communication should, of course, direct them to a particular person to answer their questions. Particularly with regard to COVID-19, I think it's really great to have a point person to take those questions and concerns rather than directing them maybe to their just to their direct supervisor or somebody like that, right? Send them to your COVID-19 team leader or the person in charge of those protocols, or to HR. That's often the same person. Okay, next slide, Sandy. So even with a communication like that, you will probably get employees who say, I can't come back to work, okay? And when that happens, the first thing you need to do is dive into the why. Make sure you understand that employee's why, and to the extent you can, have them be clear about that. Because we need to understand if their why is a reason that's protected by law, or if it's simply fear or a personal desire to continue to work from home now that the weather's great, they'd rather not come into the office every day, etc. Okay. There are legally protected reasons why an employee may request to not return to work, okay? And this slide sort of highlights the three most common reasons that we need to be thinking about. The first one, of course, is that COVID-19 Employment Rights Act. That was previously called Public Act 238, if that's more familiar to you guys in terms of a name. And that's the law that says if an employee has symptoms of COVID, has tested positive for COVID, or has had close contact with somebody who has a known case of COVID and the employee isn't fully vaccinated, they have to quarantine or isolate for particular periods of time, okay? So if you have somebody who's quarantining or isolating in compliance with that law, we don't want to require them to return to work until they've completed their quarantine or isolation period, of course. The next legally protected reason that you want to think through is probably the most common one we are seeing, which is I have some sort of health condition and I'm not able to return to work in the midst of a global pandemic. For example, I have severe asthma, and so if I am exposed to COVID-19, it could be a very, very significant issue for me. We saw a lot of these requests at the beginning of COVID-19, and as things have evolved, right, as the vaccine has become available, and as our numbers are beginning to drop, that analysis of risk is going to evolve as well. However, we are still in the midst of a global pandemic, And it is true that some individuals have underlying health issues that could be a disability under the ADA that put them at an increased risk for COVID-19, and also may mean they can't get vaccinated, okay? So when you have an employee say they can't come back and it's because of their own health concern, that means you need to follow the ADA reasonable accommodation process. Sandy and I don't have all the answers today as to where that process is going to lead you for each of your individual employees. But what I can tell you is you need to be aware that you might need to accommodate those employees, and if they request to stay home because of their own health issue, then you need to follow that ADA reasonable accommodation process. And then we've got resources to help you through that on an individual employee basis. And then the last legal concern that I would want you to be thinking about is your compliance with those MIOSHA rules, right? So you may very well probably have individuals who are still frightened to come into the workplace because they think it's not safe. And so you need to anticipate the possibility that they're going to call MIOSHA if you push them to come into work. And so be prepared for that when you have those individuals pushing back, and just do a check. Make sure that you are in substantial compliance with those MIOSHA rules, both so that you can articulate that to the employee as they're raising the concerns, and also in case you have to respond to a MIOSHA investigation, right? Do you have your COVID-19 preparedness plan? Have employees done the training? All of those things that Sandy talked about previously. And then, of course, there's the practical risks. Are we going to truly terminate employees if they are not prepared to come into work? And again, that's something that all of you are going to be taking on a case-by-case basis, evaluating culture, the importance of being at work, et cetera. Lots of employers are managing through all of those questions now. All right, next slide. So we have about 5 minutes, and I am going to answer a few more questions with our remaining time, if that's okay. Sandy, first, do you have anything to add to that refusal to work discussion?
No, I think that's right on point, that it really is always drawing down to what is the reason, and then kind of going through that checklist of going, okay, is this reason protected by state or federal law, or do we have a policy here at our own at our company that allows somebody to not work for this reason, and kind of going through that analysis.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm getting some questions already along the lines of, can you ask, if an employee is saying they can't return because of their own health issue, can you ask for documentation of that? And the answer is absolutely yes. This is the same ADA reasonable accommodation process as we know from other issues, and that process can include the employer asking for documentation of that, or even better, having a form ready to go that asks very specific questions for a healthcare provider to answer. And we do have on our COVID-19 Resource Center all of those forms that you would want to use to follow that process. Okay. 222. I'm looking at another question. Oh, this is a good one. What about the lack of childcare issue, Sandy?
Yep.
What if employees don't want to come back to work because they say they do not have childcare?
Right. So a couple things, right? Again, how we've moved through this evolution. I'll say, as we sit right now, in employees' inability to work due to a childcare reason is not a protected reason under state or federal law, right? For those who have ridden this wave, we know for some of our listeners, right, we used to have a mandated paid sick leave benefit and expanded FMLA benefit through the FFCRA, but that mandate went away at the end of December. So as we sit right now, if we're talking about a child care reason, it generally is not going to be protected. The only caveat is under Michigan's Paid Medical Leave Act. If the employee's child's school or place of care is closed, right, and it's related to kind of, right, public health emergency, that's kind of what we're talking about here, that is protected leave. But remember that is only up to 40 hours a year, or if your employee policy is more generous than that, that certainly could be a reason covered under that. But if we're talking about months and months and months, that is not a reason that is protected under federal law anymore.
Yeah, right, exactly. And let's be clear, the closure of schools and child care facilities are few and far between. As that comes up, it's usually in the context of kids being sent home for quarantine reasons or something like that. I think if I'm guessing, the more common concern is, well, I've been working from home, and so I gave up my childcare and I just don't have any right now. I need time in order to get it. That's not a legally protected reason not to come back to work, but that could very well be something that an organization needs to think through if that is going to be a concern for a number of employees. In this market right now, I would hate to have a company lose really good people because they're forced to quit simply because they weren't given sufficient time to line up childcare before being required to come back to work, right? That seems like we're maybe not thinking through how that's gonna play out. So just keep that in mind as you're working through that issue. Okay, I'm gonna do something that I try not to do, and that is I'm gonna end by trying to answer a really tough question that doesn't have a great answer. Sandy, are you ready? I don't know why. So I'm getting a lot of questions along these lines. Can I have different rules, right? Assuming things get relaxed for employees who are fully vaccinated, right? Can I begin to really have that differentiation in my workplace? For example, can I have meeting rooms in which you don't have to wear a mask if you've been fully vaccinated? Can I have different social distancing space, right? Can I do things that are going to make it obvious within my workplace who has been fully vaccinated and who has not, or is that a legal concern? And what I'll say first is the status of being vaccinated or not is not a legally protected class. I know that some individuals might not be able to get vaccinated because of an underlying medical issue, but that is certainly not even close to the only reason a person might not be fully vaccinated, right? So not being vaccinated doesn't put you in a protected class. And so if you want to draw those lines, I don't see significant legal issues with doing that as the rules stand now and as the law stands now. I do see cultural issues that you are going to need to think through, and that is going to require you to be very mindful about how you communicate those changes in your workplace to employees. That is going to be a very, very controversial or viewed as a controversial position to take among, a not insignificant percentage of your workforce. And so if you're going to start doing those things, I think you need to be able to explain to employees why, and be able to stand behind that, and also anticipate that some individuals are really going to not like it, and you need to be okay with that. Any more thoughts on that, Sandy?
I would say I thank you for taking that on, because that definitely is an underlying theme with a number of outstanding questions, are what differentiations can we make, right, on vaccinated or unvaccinated status. So hopefully that was really helpful to our listeners. And as we've been saying all morning, things can change too, related to all of these pieces with respect to what changes might happen to the MIOSHA rules or the MDHHS guidance. So we will continue to watch those like a hawk. We promise you will hear from us again when those are revised.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I hope everyone has a fantastic weekend, and I bet we will be connecting again next week to talk more about all of this. So thanks all.
Absolutely. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Yep. Bye-bye.